Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst on day 74 of self-quarantine. Listen, guys, this is going to be a different kind of show. We taped our interviews before the country erupted in protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. But the interviews are still important and timely. There's so much happening right now in the era of COVID and the pandemic and the government's inability to respond to the basic necessities of our citizens. And we want to make sure that people keep in mind the urgency of so many different issues. And that's why I think it's really important that we continue to discuss the climate crisis. And we have two guests on today that are going to discuss these things. Margaret Klein Salamon is the author of Facing the Climate Emergency. She's a clinical psychologist, and she's been using her tactics as a psychologist to express and communicate and organize around the urgency of now regarding climate change. She's the founder of Climate Mobilization, of course, if you follow them too. And then we have Eva Putzova, who's a congressional candidate in Arizona's 1st District. She's challenging an existing lawmaker who was previously Republican just a few years ago, but she plans to represent the district in the country, the area of the country that has the most COVID cases per capita. We're talking about the Navajo Nation, an indigenous community, and she has been there fighting for them for months, sounding the alarm on the injustices in this community. And now the country is now aware of what's happening in their community in relation to COVID. But first, we're going to talk about George Floyd and what's happening in this country. If you aren't already, please click subscribe, like on YouTube, please share on social media. And thank you to all of our patrons. As you know, we've launched this show just before the pandemic, so you are keeping our show going. It is hard work, as you can imagine. We have an amazing team, and your patronage is really making a huge difference. And if you are interested in becoming a patron, please go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for as low as $5 a month. We're also now offering swag like the mugs, the Nomiki Show mugs and bags and stickers. So, there's some extra stuff there, and we'll be releasing more interviews to patrons only. And of course, they get access to the show early. I keep hearing lawmakers and leaders and influencers saying that this moment right now is a little bit different, that the curtain's been pulled back, that people have had enough, that society is frustrated, and that when we see cities flooded, the streets flooded during a quarantine, when you see all of these folks who are being affected and hurt and injured by their government, and they're voicing their outrage and pain at their government and at the media and capitalism, they're saying that this is a different moment. I don't think so. I think that if you were to ask anybody who has dealt with the pain of having a loved one killed by the police and voicing that outrage at the police, at the media, in their communities, organizing hundreds, sometimes thousands of people on the streets in outrage, demanding accountability from their oftentimes democratic lawmakers, I don't think that they see this moment as different. This happens every day. Every single day, people of color are suffering the effects of a government built on white supremacy. White supremacy did not go away. There is still lynching, visible lynching on camera. And that might be what motivates thousands of people and allies to flood the streets right now and previously. That might be the pressure point. But the systemic issues that are being revealed right now so clearly are creating the battle lines between, are you an ally of the people or are you an ally of white supremacy? Because that's what this comes down to. George Floyd did nothing wrong. We know that. The outrage on the streets is the outrage of thousands of hours of documentation of police brutality for no reason. That is systemic in law enforcement, so much so that just a few years ago, the FBI was investigating police forces across the country for having white supremacy inside the force. This is what a white supremacist state looks like. The state exercises its power over the people with its police force and military. But let's not kid ourselves. The capitalism that also exists in this country is what slavery was the model for. I'm hearing people online, Democrats online, talking about, well, you know, the protesters have to be respectful of property. Let's rewind a little bit. Property. What does property represent? When you look at the original sin of this country, when colonial kings sent out colonists to come here and ravage the indigenous communities, it was about property. When African Americans were pulled from their homes overseas against their will, tortured, and forced to work without any money or property. Property was the goal here in the United States, what became the United States in the Americas. That was the goal of the oppressors, of the supremacists, because it was very clear it came down to your skin tone. We know this, right? We've all learned our history if you're watching my show. It was about property, not about lives. It was about property. And that continued on with redlining. And when you see areas of this country that are on the front lines of climate change, the front lines of food deserts, on the front lines of no economic development or investment, on the front lines of the charter school scheme, on the front lines of schools that are not funded, on the front lines of no access to clean water. That comes down to where you live, property. Everything in this country is based on what zip code you were born into and what color your skin is. Let's not fool ourselves right now. So what you're seeing on the streets is not just the outrage at the police state, which is there to control the masses. It is not just an outrage to the murder of civilians in 2020 for doing nothing wrong, based on a culture, a brainwashing of white supremacy in this country. It is to control the capitalist system that is built to benefit a small group of people who just happen to be white men. So when people say, don't make it about skin color, let's not pit everybody against each other. You're right. We should not be pitting everybody against each other. We should be acting in solidarity. White, black, brown, Latino, Asian, immigrants. We should all be working together to challenge this system because the police state is the weapon of the capitalist state. When you are born in a zip code and you don't know if your father will get locked up or not for something unjust, setting off your life course because suddenly your home is a single parent home. Your mom, who works 2-3 jobs, has to support the family. This is what neoliberalism designed. They designed the crime bill. They took the real estate developer money that made modern day redlining okay. They're the ones who backed charter schools that were racist. They are the ones who decided to strip funding from public schools. They are the ones who have not fought for a fair wage and for workers' rights. They are the ones who took on unions in the late 70s and kicked them out of the Democratic Party and brought in the lobbyists. They are the ones who thought, oh, it is okay to target Black and brown communities, to join the military and offer them schooling or gimmicks. This is a neoliberal plan, not a right-wing plan. And if you are watching our Democratic mayors around the country right now and saying, why aren't they doing something? Why are they being silent? Why are they tweeting supportive protesters, or in worst cases, yelling at protesters and calling them looters? Well, looting, oh, we know about looting. Our country was built off of looting. Our country was built off of extraordinary pressure on the masses to survive while they loot our pockets, our wages, our work, our labor. And we know very well where that comes from. The economic system of slavery. That is the capitalism that drives this country. So let's be real right now. There is nothing new about this moment. This moment is nothing different. What's happening right now is people across America are in their homes, fed up, frustrated, that it is not just Black and brown communities who are worried about how they are going to be able to stay in their homes, to pay their bills, to feed their children, to feed themselves, to pay for the gas to get to work, to pay for the Metro card to get to work, whether or not they have work. Let's be very clear, whether or not they have work. It is not just Black and brown communities now. It is spread. Middle class, white middle class are worried. Small business owners are worried. But when you look at who is being looted, it is being targeted at the multinational corporations who have been looting our country. The lobbyists who represent these multinational corporations and banks that are working with these Democratic lawmakers who say they support Black Lives Matter. And they do not condone the acts of violent police, but will do nothing when it comes down to challenging the white supremacy that exists in our police departments. Is it every police officer? No, we know that. But it is a culture that is spread. The FBI is literally investigating this. This is the legacy of white supremacy that has just taken new forms. Capitalism is a tool to suppress the masses, to extract from the masses their labor, their money, their work, their value, so that a few can hoard the resources at the top, can hoard the property. What is going to happen in New York when so many New Yorkers flee because they can't afford to pay their rent? What is going to happen? You're going to have distressed assets all over the city. People on the front lines who have been victims of coronavirus, first and foremost, who do not have access to health care, who cannot afford. How many Americans cannot afford to just treat a cold or a flu or a minor ailment? This is all a symptom of the greater systemic issues of this country that, let's not forget, were built from the business model of white supremacy. So as allies, as organizers, as activists, let's remember who the real enemy is here. And frankly, our Democrats who are sitting silent right now are saying, go vote. That's how you will weed out white supremacy. The Democratic mayors who still to this day are beholden to the right-wing police unions across this country, who are beholden to the real estate developers across this country, to the bankers, they should be feeling the pressure. Because if you are sitting silent or not challenging the egregiousness that is coming from these forces, then you are an ally of the white supremacists. Now is the time to stand up. What is different about this moment is now is the time to stand up. There are no solutions being presented by our Democratic lawmakers right now. We are in the middle of an election, in a pandemic, in which we are about to face the worst economic situation we have since the Great Depression. And there are no solutions being presented by our supposed nominee and the Democratic Party. Why are they staying silent? What are they afraid of? Why are they so afraid of taking on the banks and the insurance companies and the real estate developers and the police? Why? Do they see what's happening on the streets? Do they think it's okay to stay silent? Because the buck stops at them. We know what the right wing is going to do. But when you see Democratic mayors resisting, calling for investigations or prosecutions of very clear and documented murders, then what are they there for? What are they there for? That's not Democratic light. That is white supremacy ally. That is being an ally of this system that is oppressing people across this country. And I am saying this right now from the comfort of my home. And I am also worried, but I am nowhere near worried as those who are on the front lines. And it is my duty as an ally to speak up and shine light. And if you have that ability to do so, call attention, demand answers. Why is Bill de Blasio not out on the streets? Why is not every single mayor in America out on the streets right now with the protesters saying, all right, it is time to stand up to the police unions. It is time to stand up to the real estate developers. It is time. Because then the moment will be different. Then this moment will be different. When we start to see the neoliberals stand up, be courageous. If you're not going to be courageous now, what is the point of any of this? We are highlighting progressive working class women who are challenging the establishment, running grassroots campaigns without corporate money on a very progressive platform that they have signed on to with their life. But we are highlighting the candidates as the races start to gear up. You know, they're, as you're all aware, everybody's campaigning during COVID right now, and there's a whole other set of issues that progressive working class women are facing when running, not to mention the slew that they're already facing just as candidates running against the establishment. We have Eva Putzova, who is running in Arizona's 1st congressional district against Tom O'Halloran. He is an incumbent. Fun fact, he became a Democrat in 2016, so she's basically running against a Republican in Arizona. Eva, thank you for joining us. I am fascinated by your race because where I am right now, sitting in Arizona, you're like across the street is your district. I could just like throw a rock and hit your district, but it's a very big district. I say that because you're actually several hundreds of miles away from where I am in northern Arizona. Can you tell us just a little bit about the lay of the land, and then we'll get to the meat of it?
Thank you, Nomiki, for having me here. So yes, I'm running in one of the largest districts in the country. It's actually 3 times as big as the country where I was born, which is Slovakia, the former Czechoslovakia. And it is really large, and it is a diverse district. It also has the largest Native American population of any district. 25% of people who live in district are Native Americans. It is mostly a rural district. The largest city is Flagstaff, which is, about 75,000 people on a good day. And a lot of smaller towns and a lot of rural areas. So it's a very interesting district. It's a very important district. And this district has to go into the hands of a real Democrat, into the hands of a progressive Democrat. Because whether we've had a Republican representing this district or Democrat representing this district, nothing has fundamentally changed for the people who work here, who live here, who are part of this big community.
You know, it's interesting because, as you know, I serve on the board of Matriarch, and we get a lot of questions about our candidates. Are they all challenging Democrats? It's a mix. We are supporting a lot of candidates that are running in open districts where they have open seats and crowded primaries. And then there are a few candidates who are running against very bad Democrats. And when I say very bad, you know, there are bad Democrats, there are corporate Democrats, and then there are Democrats who just team up with Republicans in the House. And you are running against somebody who, of course, as we just said, was a Republican just a few years ago, became a Democrat because the district is leaning more Democratic. And I think that's really interesting to me because this is a rural district, and I think most Americans would probably say, oh, well, if it's rural, it's probably, maybe even the DCCC thinks that. If it's rural, it's probably a little bit more Republican. But, you know, rural communities, I think this narrative has been reinforced through the presidential primary process. Rural communities are responding to a progressive populist message, and that is what you're running on. But now you add in the element of indigenous communities. And the New York Times a few weeks ago raised awareness about an issue you've been talking about on the campaign trail, which is the rates of COVID being the highest in the Navajo Nation, which falls into your district. I believe last check it was around 14.5% of the Navajo Nation was affected by COVID, with you know, a little under 200 people who've been killed. So you're campaigning and you're talking about COVID on a campaign trail that doesn't really exist, but you're at the epicenter. I mean, those are higher rates than Queens, which was previously the epicenter. Talk about what your experience is like campaigning on this issue and working with the community, the indigenous community of your district.
So the COVID-19 crisis really illuminated what has been wrong in indigenous territories for way too long. It is just this crisis shed real light on those issues that people in this district, but also in other Native American communities, have been dealing for way too long. So right now, you correctly noted that the COVID-19 rate is the highest per capita on the Navajo Nation. In fact, 159 people died, and currently, as of today, there are 5,000 positive COVID-19 cases. And the reason why this is important is to understand that when we say wash your hands, 30% of the people living on the Navajo Nation don't have access to running water. When we talk about how people have to get access to healthcare facilities if they're facing emergency, we have to understand that so many hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads on the Navajo Nation specifically are unpaved. It can take 2-3 hours to get to a facility that can deal with the kind of emergency that we see people with COVID-19 deal with. And of course, a lot of people don't have electricity. They don't have access to reliable internet. That also means that the information, the flow of information is impacted. And all this is a result of a complete bipartisan failure. So it is nice that the Congress is appropriating money to the Navajo Nation and to other indigenous communities. The problem is that we have to resolve these failures in the basic infrastructure. We need to get people water, electricity, paved roads, healthcare, and education. And that's what we have to change. And it hasn't changed with a Democrat in the House, and certainly 10 or so years ago when we had a Republican, that issue has not been addressed.
How are you communicating with the community right now, as everybody, every congressional candidate is faced with a very different style of campaigning, especially on the grassroots side?
Mm-hmm. So we as a campaign, we face additional challenges, obviously. The challenges that I mentioned, that it is sometimes difficult to reach people because of the distance. So under normal circumstances, campaigning in this district is very different. We, under normal circumstances, we would be still using digital tools. We would be calling voters, texting voters, and we would be using social media to reach to every corner of this district. Today, in these COVID-19 days, social media has been a great tool for us to reach out to people, to learn what's going on, and to also spread the message. And again, we see the failure of our government because it took the initiative of private citizens to actually set up mutual aid networks that would bring relief to the Navajo and the Hopi families. And you may have heard about this effort that was started by the former Navajo Nation Attorney General Ethel Branch, who launched a GoFundMe account. And they were successful. They raised, I think, around $4.5 million, but not because of any help of our representatives or government officials who are responsible for the response to this crisis.
It's unreal that we pass these packages like the CARE Act and now the HEROES Act, and yes, like you said, they're allocating hundreds of millions of dollars across multiple communities, but a lot of the money is being held up for lawsuits, and especially the money that's dealing with the economic aspects of the COVID crisis, which of course you just addressed is the underlying situation. When you live in a community that's been shut off from the world, doesn't have access to water, people have to walk to get their water every day. I mean, it's 2020, and it's a failure on our government's part. You have been in public service. You have fought for the underdog. I mean, you are an immigrant, as you said, and there's a special zest that comes from you when you're fighting for your community. Let's talk about some of your history and what you've done for your community, again, as an immigrant coming to your community.
So I became a U.S. citizen in 2007. And the day after I became a U.S. citizen, I registered to vote, and I registered to vote as a Democrat. And I don't mean just Democrat with a capital D. I mean the Democrat with a lowercase d, because I believe in justice, I believe in peace, I believe in democracy, equality. Those are the values that drive me every single day. In 2012, actually, it was the very first time when I was thinking about running for Congress. I was helping at the time Winona Benali Baldenegro, a Diné woman who was running for Congress in this congressional district 1 at the time, challenging Ann Kirkpatrick. And I realized, looking at the 2008 recovery, just how completely unequal access to relief was. We bailed out the corporations, and the regular people got crumbs. Right. Their lives have not improved. And I thought I would, and I could make a difference. I talked to, as it often happens, we talked to people in a leadership position at the Democratic Party. And this gentleman told me, you should run for some lower office, like city council. So I did. I decided, okay, I'm going to make a difference at the local level. And in 2014, I was elected to the Flagstaff City Council, and I served there for 4 years. I ran a local citizen initiative that raised the minimum wage in Flagstaff to $15, and then through the council amendment process to $15.50. And we also raised the sub-minimum tipped wage, which, as many people know, is an exploitative wage that in way too many communities, in way too many states, in fact, there are 17 states where tipped workers make only $2.13. in Arizona, they make $3 below the regular minimum wage. And so in Flagstaff, we passed this ordinance, voters approved it, and the tipped workers, along with the regular minimum wage workers, will continue to see increases. That initiative was then attacked in 2018. The local Chamber of Commerce, with dark money from Koch brothers network, put together an attempted repeal, which we successfully defeated, and that ordinance is intact. And so that was my way to helping the community at the local level. Of course, this was the process outside of the legislative council-led process that I was also part of. And so on the city council, I was instrumental in passing city's first climate action plan, city's first paid parental leave policy, and also Indigenous Peoples Day, because I believe we have to start addressing some of the underlying issues, including racial profiling of our native communities, our neighbors, our friends who live here, and they are being arrested at rates that are completely disgusting. In Flagstaff, just so you know, more than 52% of all arrests by local police are Native Americans.
Wow.
And that's shocking, because only 12% of the population are actually Native here in the city.
I was wondering how that overlapped. And as you said, Flagstaff's a very small community, so how is the establishment responding to you, I mean, when you were in the city council and now running for office?
Well, you can just
in the media.
you can just imagine. I was told all kinds of things like, why don't you just wait until the incumbent is done with what he's doing? As if
what does that mean?
Right, just let him finish.
Wrecking the community?
right, or doing nothing. Yeah. I was told, why don't you run in this other district, Gosar's district, where actually Democrat has no chance of winning at all. I was told, well, unless you're going to raise 150,000 in the first 3 months, you're irrelevant. I mean, things that, all of us, and especially progressive women, we hear it all the time. I think what is happening is really fear. I think the Democratic Party leadership, they would like us to disappear. They don't like the fact that we have functioning mouth, and we talk. And we are not afraid to talk about the issues we have to fix in our own Democratic Party to make it democratic. And so, we are running a grassroots campaign. We made a decision very early on, and it was a very easy decision, that we are not going to take single penny from any corporate interest. And in fact, we're not taking any political action committee money. It is completely grassroots campaign, powered and paid for by regular people who want to see the change in Washington.
It is a metric I think a lot of people aren't aware of, that most candidates, just in general, but especially women, are given these metrics from organizations, institutional organizations, that will put themselves out there as, supporting candidates early on. But if you don't raise, said number, and this happens on the progressive side too, whether it's even intentional, sometimes it's just like, well, that candidate doesn't have a chance. Well, why doesn't that candidate have a chance? And then when you start to break it down, you realize, it's because they haven't raised $150,000, $200,000 within 6 weeks of announcing, or 8 weeks of announcing. And then in other cases, you have even progressive figures who don't want to get involved early because they want to see how the candidate evolves. But it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they're not getting that early support, if you're not getting early support or endorsements early, then it affects you in the long term. It affects your ability to fundraise. It affects your ability to get press. Press, of course, affects your ability to fundraise. And it's like, as I'm sure you're seeing, once you get an endorsement, then others start to jump up. But there's some real structural issues that I don't know if if most progressives are even aware of. It's important that folks like yourself are supported early, especially, I mean, what's so alarming to me is you've been in office. You've made real change in office. You've proven that you're the real deal. And, I'm just glad that you've been able to kind of shake up this race. It's unfortunate that we're in COVID, but you had a little bit of an experience with the media here, and I think this is important. This is an important message for people to really understand the kinds of day-to-day obstacles progressive women face when they're not institutionally propped up. I mean, that's really what this comes down to. So what happened with the Arizona Republic, which is the largest newspaper in Arizona, for those of you who don't know?
Yeah, so Arizona Republic published an opinion piece essentially chastising us for raising campaign money in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, which is, we are raising money because we want to make sure that in the future, we don't have government that's completely unprepared for crisis, that we actually have a country where people can live with dignity. And so to tell us that you have to pause fundraising, obviously people who contribute to us, who support us, they want to see change. Obviously, people give us, even when they can give $2, $3, because they believe it is important. Mm-hmm. We can help our neighbors and friends who are in the need of immediate relief, and at the same time, work to change this country because the structures and the systems are broken. And so, so it was kind of they were talking about our campaign as, we are heartless, or in a way we are tone deaf. I think that's what the language they used. And what's tone deaf? When you take $500,000 from corporate interests, including private prison industry, arms industry, health insurance companies, corrupted utility like APS in Arizona, that's the money that my opponent, the incumbent, is taking from these entities to fund his campaign and then to support the interests of those who fund his campaign. And to me, that is tone deaf.
It's also ridiculous. Everybody's fundraising, including your opponent, is fundraising in the middle of COVID. It just seemed like a heartless hit, and also like they didn't have anything to go after you on. But then they didn't let you respond, right?
Yeah, I try to, normally, I mean, there is an op-ed against and something, and that's fine. It's an opinion. You have the right to publish any opinion, and you would think that we would have an opportunity to respond. But we didn't have that opportunity. That's their prerogative. And we are doing well in terms of our campaign growth. We are connecting with voters. We are raising money. And I do believe that we are going to show not just to people in Arizona and in people in Arizona's Democratic Party, but also the national leadership, that we are serious, that this campaign is we're not doing this for fun. This is the hardest thing in the world. And Nomiki, how we women have even harder time raising money. We know that while we women, 80% of all consumer spending is driven by women. When it comes to political giving, 60% of all donors are men. And when men give, they give more to male candidates. And so we face the kind of obstacles and challenges. We're making progress, but not really when it comes to money. And we have to change that. And this is also the reason why we are underrepresented in Congress. Less than 25% of all representatives are women.
Yeah. And they keep saying, we're going to hit parity, meaning equal representation in Congress, but at least I believe personally that has to fundamentally change by changing the business model of how women get there. And when you put women forward that are a reflection of their communities and the issues that their communities are facing and are actively fighting for their communities, it makes them more electable. And you know, in your case, you've done this work. So I think you bring up some very important points about the institutional struggles that progressive women are facing. So Eva, excuse me, where can people learn about your campaign? What do you need right now? Because your election is on August, what was it?
August 4th. So we are 68 days away from the primary election, but who's counting, right? And every day matters. Right now we need two things. And you can accomplish both two things on our website. If you want to have a progressive woman in Congress, support us with your contribution, with a donation, and you can go to evaforcongress.com/donate, and that's EVA. It's my first name.
We'll put it up there.
and then we want you to help us and volunteer with our campaign. We have an extensive phone banking operation, and we would love to have you as part of our team. And again, you can go to evaforcongress.com/volunteer. And those are the two great ways to help us in a meaningful way. You can also follow us on Twitter, and my Twitter is Eva Putzova. And of course, on Facebook and Instagram, I'm super easy to find. There are no other Evas running in Arizona or in the country. And we welcome you to our campaign. We have a lot of young people. We are a very diverse campaign, and we want you to be part of this. If we can change this district, because this district votes for Democrats. And we've had a Democratic representative since last redistricting, and so there's no reason to worry about that. And so we can have this district in the hands of a progressive, because it is important that we fight for the Green New Deal, and then we spend trillions of dollars on rebuilding our communities rather than trillions of dollars on modernizing our country's nuclear arsenal, which we know both Obama and Trump administrations actually supported. So there are so many things that we have to accomplish in this country, in this district, and I want you to be part of it.
Thank you for watching and listening to the Nomiki Show. Make sure to click like and subscribe on YouTube and share with everybody on social media. And of course, if you're not a patron already, please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for as low as $5 a month. That money makes a huge difference. We don't have the corporate money coming in. We're not cable news that's raking in the dough from advertisers right now as everybody's sitting at home and watching. It is really you guys who are keeping us together. So please consider being a patron. And for those of you who have already, we are incredibly grateful to you. We're in an emergency. I mean, obviously we're in a political emergency and we're in a pandemic, but I don't know if you realize we are currently in a climate emergency. Like code red, sound the alarms, people are dying and migrating. Is that the way it seems on TV? Is that the way it's being expressed through politicians? It doesn't seem so, but our next guest has used her background as a psychologist in communicating that and mobilizing around the climate disaster with her organization that she founded, Climate Mobilization. She's the executive director of Climate Mobilization, and she has a new book out called Facing the Climate Emergency: How to Transform Yourself with the Climate Truth. Margaret Klein Salamon, thank you so much for joining us in the midst of this pandemic. You know, I'm sure there's lots of other things that you can bring to light in relation to the climate emergency that we're facing. So why did you shift from your work as a psychologist to the climate disaster?
I started to become overwhelmed by fear. I was living in New York City, came here to pursue my PhD in clinical psychology in 2009, and then Hurricane Sandy happened, Hurricane Irene happened. The climate changes were becoming quite palpable, like how suddenly there's these downpours, and then, you know, like in the rainforest kind of rain patterns. And what I was reading was just it was so horrible. So really it was also an emotional process for me of getting strong enough to face what I was reading. So eventually it started to be like a red alarm flashing in my face all the time. I couldn't really focus on anything else. So I started writing about the climate emergency and the psychological elements.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, it does seem like our politicians are definitely in denial, but I mean, that could be based on campaign finance issues, like where they're taking their money from, red state, blue state stuff. But globally, it seems like even other countries are still a bit in denial. We talk about the negotiations when it comes to climate policy, but I don't think any real climate activists feel like anybody is really taking a vocal stance when it comes to this crisis. So what psychological factors are just right out there in the open that you can clearly, diagnose?
So there's a lot, and many of which, such as humans' tendency to discount future risks and focus on the immediate present. So there's a lot of different factors that hold us back from full engagement or treating this like the emergency it is. But one of the most important and most powerful, that is also the most changeable, is pluralistic ignorance, or what Yale Climate Communications calls the spiral of silence. The fact that many, many, many Americans are very worried about the climate emergency. 56% of Americans recognize that climate is an emergency, or excuse me, that's of voters. But so there's a level of alarm, there's a real level of fear, but we're not making the leap from our own personal concern to talking about it or engaging with this socially and politically. And that creates this phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, or what Václav Havel called living in the lie, where even if we're privately worried, if what everybody sees is just us just living our lives, right, as normal, that is actually sending a signal to everyone that I'm not so worried about this emergency. Things are basically fine. And so what is so important and exciting about understanding this pluralistic ignorance is that it really can be changed, and rapidly. That's how Václav Havel helped create the Velvet Revolution. And because through turning a collective unsaid understanding into one that is, given the attention that it deserves, like that kind of wall-to-wall media attention that we're seeing the coronavirus.
Right.
Yet, that's it has just tremendous power.
So what would be some of the things that could be done to be able to communicate the immediacy of the moment? I actually can just speak from a personal experience. I was talking to a close family member who is progressive just the other day, a little bit older, and I said something. They were like actually communicating their stress about the climate crisis, and they said, God, it's coming, it's so soon. I said, no, it's now. Well, no, I mean, not really. And I said, well, what do you expect? Do you expect like the ice caps to just melt and instantly we're underwater? And of course it's happening right now. I mean, you have more hurricanes. But New York's not underwater, but it was underwater actually, and we were there. And so there was this back and forth about just the reality of, we were all on the same page, but we weren't at the same moment of crisis. And I feel like what does it take if you say, once that switch goes off, what does it take to get people to realize it's here now, we're screwed, and let's have a velvet revolution?
Yeah, so great point. And It's absolutely true. And of course, part of why is the multi-billion-dollar misinformation campaign and lobbying efforts on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, any conversation about what the public thinks or feels about the climate emergency has to recognize that, the most profitable industry on the planet has been intentionally lying to us for decades with incredible success. And so because of that effort and because of the media's failure and broad institutional failure, people largely don't understand how bad this is. I mean, and the movement hasn't done a good job either in terms of conveying that because of these ridiculous ideas such as, oh, we can't scare people.
So why is that?
The climate movement has a lot of bad ideas that come from like the culture of science, particularly of like calm, rational, stoic, like hyper precise, never, ever, ever exaggerate something. I mean, my God, right? So just the language they use is like, Larry Kramer, the AIDS activist and founder of ACT UP, he recently died just 2 days ago. I mean, it's like the opposite of him. He was full of passionate rage and warning, and conveyed through his words and his presence that, like you said, does every gay man in the city want to die? Like, this is coming for us, people. And yeah, so the climate movement for the past 30 years has been so reticent to really reckon with the fact that this is, we're talking about the collapse of civilization. We're talking about the deaths of billions of people. It is really hard to overstate this. And yeah, most Americans don't know how advanced, how both the scope and, like you said, the timeline, but my hope is that the coronavirus is helping people understand this more, because climate and corona are both unfolding at an exponential rate. And so this idea of curves that go way, way, way up, like really quickly, and therefore the necessity to intervene before New York City is underwater. Right. By the time we get there, we won't be able to intervene anymore.
Right. And I think there's the way that it's reported, even the natural disasters that occur on a day-to-day basis. I mean, people are losing their homes in Tornado Alley at a more regular rate, I guess, because there's more tornadoes, or the hurricanes are, hitting regions like I spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico, as our viewers know, that have been prepared for hurricanes for 100 years, are obviously being affected more. So, but the news coverage, it's like also not connecting the dots. It's like, oh, there was a really bad storm. By the way, this is climate change now. And unless we do something, it's just going to happen again, or worse, and it's going to come to your backyard. Or in red states where it is affecting them, they don't realize that is climate change. It's not some sort of whatever cyclical climate thing that Fox News claims it is.
Absolutely. And what you're talking about, the omission of climate from these, natural disaster stories, is a huge, huge problem. And I mean, honestly, media crime. It's not just Fox News. It's every broadcast cable channel. TV is by far the worst. Every type of media should be reporting on this much more, but TV virtually doesn't. So yeah, that is absolutely a huge factor. The failure of media coverage. I mean, again, climate should be getting coronavirus style coverage, but the minimum, the bare minimum is just to include it in stories that you're already writing where it's totally relevant. This is what Genevieve Gunther does at End Climate Silence. She's a literature professor who on Twitter is just calling out and constantly and also helping, but media to do just this. And it's so important. And she's had a big impact, but I mean, it's like such a huge problem that got to keep going.
So in terms of the work that you guys are doing organizationally and educating folks and mobilizing them, can you explain some of the efforts you guys are doing and how people can get more engaged? Like, how can someone, just an everyday citizen, take part in dispelling the myths and communicating climate, the emergency?
Yeah, great. So a couple of things. First, as you mentioned, I really go into depth in this in terms of my recent book, which you mentioned, Facing the Climate Emergency, How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. In fact, there's a chapter, the final chapter, devoted to this question because it's actually really complicated, right? What should one individual do in order to protect humanity and the living world it's as complex and personal as a career choice. So there's no one answer, but we can and have to think about where what we bring meets what the movement needs. So, what most people do, and is a great thing to do, is community organizing. But there's also, if you have special skills, right? If you're a graphic designer, you can volunteer as a graphic designer for a climate emergency organization. If you're a bookkeeper or a lawyer or whatever, fundraiser, if you're willing to do the job no one wants.
Yes, exactly.
So I mean, there's so many things, so many ways. So the first thing to do, the one thing that every single person should do, is talk about it. Talk about the climate emergency with your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues. I mean, just talk about it whenever it's relevant. And it's relevant in most conversations, actually. So
I'm sorry, just for on that note, how do you talk about it? I mean, how do you talk about it with someone that may not, maybe they do listen to Rush Limbaugh and Fox News all day long, but they're they live in Florida or Texas facing drought. I mean, maybe they're whatever it is, everybody's facing this, but how do you communicate it with climate deniers or skeptics?
So it's a good question, but you don't need to start there, right? Have an easy one. I mean, it's still challenging, but talk to the Democrats in your life that are activists or progressives or that aren't or whatever. And I mean, share your personal experience of this. Talk about how you feel. Don't give a PowerPoint about climate science. That's not this while scientists brought this issue to our attention, that does not mean that we can't relate to it in human terms. So talk about what you think the future holds and what you fear and any action that you've done or are considering, and ask the other person what they feel about the climate and the future. And what's amazing when you start to initiate these conversations, I mean, it's really sad, but I hear people say all the time, oh my gosh, no one ever asked me how I feel about the climate emergency. And it's like, this is apocalyptic. I mean, and nobody has considered that it might be painful or scary or like we need to go there. So talking, those kinds of conversations are a kind of organizing or activism that we can do during this quarantine, whatever, lockdown period. And then the second thing that people should do is find their way into and in the climate emergency movement. So groups like the Climate Mobilization, and I'll talk about our work, but yes, Sunrise, Extinction Rebellion, the School Strikers, or the Climate Mobilization, and our allies, are the key organizing strategy we've been working on for the past year and a half are these climate emergency declarations and local campaigning. So over 1,500 governments now globally have declared a climate emergency and implemented various levels of follow-on measures. Nobody, I mean, with some exciting results, nobody I can point to and say, like, yes, they're doing enough, because there's so incredibly much to do. But like Ann Arbor, Michigan, for example, declared a climate emergency and then presented a $1 billion plan to bring the city to zero emissions by 2030. So, I mean, that's, you know, extremely ambitious for a city of that size. And yeah, and a group of cities in California that declared a climate emergency then banned gas hookups in new construction for heating or appliances. And that's spread to like 20 cities now. So anyway, the climate emergency movement that I'm talking about is distinct from the gradualist climate movement that's been around for decades. So join the movement that says we need emergency action now, and a transition to zero emissions as quickly as humanly possible. None of this zero emissions by 2050, 30 years from now. Join the action as quickly as humanly possible camp.
It's interesting you say that. So I just had this horrible flashback. But I think it reiterates the points that you're trying to make about our local governments taking action and recognizing this. So I ran for office in New York City last year, and New York City is supposed to be like this progressive, you know, haven. Ha ha ha. Hilarious. But, you know, I'd say the majority of city council members represent themselves as being progressive, and they might be progressive on maybe like 85% of the issues. But at the end of the day, it's still a big business town. It's still a real estate town, and Wall Street's still located in New York City. And we had, there was a debate or a panel forum with all of the candidates, and there were several candidates. There were like 8 or 9 candidates in the race that time, and many of them were in office. And we're all talking about our climate plans. And I've been involved in the climate movement, you know, very actively involved in like fighting fracking and platform committee of the Democratic Party. And I was aghast, like the way that they were talking about climate issues, like not understanding how the biggest cause of emissions in New York is coming from natural gas leaking out of buildings, or you know, their solutions were like banning straws and recycling programs. And I like actually kind of lost it in the middle of it. Like, you guys are all in denial, and like your little, you know, banning plastic straws is cute when we're all underwater. Great, we're not going to be able to like use our plastic straws. But, you know, reflecting on that over a year later and seeing that like this is where the most progressive city that's already been affected by climate change deeply with Sandy is responding to the issues. How do we communicate to our lawmakers who may not be as informed, who really, I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is it's like maybe they do think that's the solution is banning plastic straws and bags. Like, okay, then we're going to solve this emergency. But how do we communicate to them as citizens? Because all of us live in communities across this country, and, you know, there might even be some conservatives who might be a little bit more open if there's like an energy reduction cost, you know, aspect of it, or a business, you know, cost reduction. What's your advice? Big question there.
So first of all, thank you for bringing that sense of urgency and calling out that denial, which is absolutely what it is. And I totally agree with you. There is elected leaders and media, and I mean, there's lack a full education about the climate emergency. And so if we look at, structurally why that is, I mean, again, without letting the propagandists off the hook, we can also see that there is not a think tank or academic, like policy making institutions that are working on this scale either. Right? Like I looked at the Center for American Progress's climate plan, for example, and had an experience like you. I mean, I've looked at, so many large NGOs. Still, even now, most of them are talking about zero emissions by 2050 at the most ambitious. They're still talking about gas in a positive way. So there's just all of that gradualism, half measures. It's denial. Or you could call it, it's a bargaining, right? In terms of the stages of grief. Like, okay, there's a climate emergency, but maybe a little, no plastic straws. Would that work? No, it will not. And so I do think that we definitely, clearly, super aggressive street action and political organizing is totally necessary. But we also need an institutional infrastructure that, develops policy that is actually on the scale of this emergency. And writes legislation. And so that's something that's a gap that I really would love to see some excellent left institutions step into.
And I'm sure a lot of our audience knows, but so much of this stuff is being funded. I mean, even at universities, by some sort of person or entity tied to, oil and gas, or you name the bad actors.
Yeah, it's really incredibly disturbing. And you have to readjust kind of your worldview when, as you say, you realize all of these universities are funded by Shell and Exxon, and museums are funded. And it's like, okay, we are not getting the full truth.
Right.
And that's the point. That's why they're doing it. The even so, that the actual truth is still kind of painfully clear when you have the courage to actually look at it. And that is just, we are in terrible danger, and we need to do everything we can individually and collectively to eliminate emissions, transform our entire economy and society, and stop the sixth mass extinction of species. I mean, it's huge. It's totally on a different scale than banning plastic straws, though. Yeah, we're going to need to do that too.
Right.
But that's what it is. And it's like, oh, well, achieving that's politically unrealistic or something. It's like, okay, well, then we'll collapse. Understanding the scale and urgency and timeline of the challenge, we have to do it. So let's do it.
Let's do it. Margaret, amazing work. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for shifting your career focus to saving humanity. We'll make sure to put your book title up on the screen so people know where to check it out, and where to check out your mobilizing work at Climate Mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to congressional candidate Eva Putzova and to Margaret Klein Salamon, author of Facing the Climate Emergency and founder of Climate Mobilization. For those of you who are out on the streets right now, please stay safe. Please be careful, and thank you for your courage. And for those of you who remain home, be well. See you next week.